Imagine a city where around 120,000 Russians filled the streets, where Orthodox church bells echoed every Sunday, where Russian newspapers arrived each morning, and where children studied in Russian schools thousands of kilometers from Moscow. A city built around the Chinese Eastern Railway, created by the Russian Empire in the late 19th century. A city that, for decades, became the largest Russian community anywhere outside Russia. And then it disappeared. Today, millions pass through Harbin without realizing they are walking across what was once called the Russian city in China. An entire world vanished, not in a single battle, not because of one revolution, but through years of political upheaval, occupation, impossible choices, and shattered dreams. By the middle of the 20th century, one of the greatest Russian communities ever created beyond its homeland had almost completely ceased to exist. The tragedy did not begin with destruction. It began with hope. You arrive in the early 1920s. Behind you lies the Russian Civil War and the defeat of the White Army. Thousands of officers, engineers, teachers, doctors, railway workers, priests, and their families flee eastward, carrying little more than a suitcase and the belief that exile will be temporary. They do not know they are leaving home forever. Harbin is waiting. Unlike other refugee destinations, this city already possesses everything they need. Russian neighborhoods, Orthodox churches, schools, hospitals, administrative buildings. Decades before the revolution, the Russian Empire had transformed Harbin into the heart of the Chinese Eastern Railway. When the refugees crossed the border, they stepped into a city that still looked and sounded astonishingly Russian. For a brief moment, it feels as though history has paused. But beneath the familiar language and daily routines hides a terrifying reality. Thousands of these people no longer belong to any country. They have preserved their culture, but lost their citizenship. They can rebuild their lives, yet they cannot rebuild the nation they left behind. And that impossible contradiction will shape the fate of Harbin for the next 2 decades. For a few remarkable years, Harbin seemed to have defeated history itself. You could spend an entire day without hearing a word of Chinese. Russian schools educated the next generation. Orthodox churches held packed services every Sunday. Newspapers and magazines appeared in Russian, preserving debates, literature, and news from a homeland that no longer existed in the form its readers remembered. The city was not merely a refuge. It was a complete society transplanted across the border. Yet the foundation beneath this remarkable achievement was surprisingly fragile. Most refugees believed their exile would last months, perhaps a few years. They rented apartments instead of building permanent homes. Family heirlooms remained carefully packed in trunks, ready for the day they would return to Russia. That day never came. Instead, a different reality emerged. After the revolution and subsequent Soviet decisions, thousands of former citizens of the Russian Empire effectively became stateless. They had no recognized nationality, making travel, employment, and legal protection increasingly uncertain. Every expired passport was another reminder that they belonged everywhere culturally, but nowhere politically. And then, events beyond Harbin began reshaping their future. The stability that had allowed this extraordinary Russian city to flourish depended on forces its residents could not control. Governments negotiated, borders shifted, foreign ambitions expanded across Manchuria. The refugees had escaped one revolution, only to discover they had settled in a region becoming the focus of another international struggle. Harbin still looked Russian. It still sounded Russian. But beneath its confident appearance, the ground was beginning to move. Soon, every family would be forced to answer a question they had spent years trying to avoid. If history finds you twice, where can you run next? Everything changed after Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931 and established the state of Manchukuo. Overnight, Harbin was no longer simply a refuge for Russian exiles. It became a city trapped inside a new political order, where every decision carried consequences that could determine an entire family's future. Imagine walking through the familiar streets. The churches still stand. The cafes remain open. Russian newspapers continue to circulate. At first glance, daily life appears unchanged. But appearances are deceptive. The new authorities demanded loyalty, not neutrality. Russian émigrés found themselves facing impossible choices. Should they cooperate with the Japanese administration to protect their families? Should they leave Harbin altogether, abandoning the lives they had spent more than a decade rebuilding? Or should they return to the Soviet Union, the very country many had fled after the Civil War? No option promised safety. It was during these turbulent years that Konstantin Rodzivsky emerged as the leader of the Russian Fascist Party, one of the best-known anti-Soviet émigré movements in Asia. His movement attracted attention across the region, reflecting how deeply divided the exile community had become. Yet archival research shows a different reality beneath the headlines. Not every white émigré dreamed of continuing the struggle against the Soviet regime. Countless families wanted only stability, honest work, and the hope that one day they might see their homeland again. That hope grew weaker with every passing year. Harbin had survived revolution. It had survived exile. But now the city faced something even more dangerous, a future in which every path forward demanded a painful sacrifice. And soon, another decision made far away would begin dismantling the Russian city itself. The decisive blow came in 1935. That year, the Soviet Union sold its share of the Chinese Eastern Railway to Manchukuo, ending an era that had begun under the Russian Empire decades earlier. On paper, it looked like a diplomatic agreement. In reality, it shattered the foundation on which Russian Harbin had been built. The railway was far more than steel tracks and stations. It had created the city, employed generations of Russian engineers, clerks, mechanics, teachers, and administrators, and sustained an entire social world. Once control changed hands, that world began to unravel. Thousands of Soviet employees left Harbin after the sale. Their departure emptied offices, workshops, and neighborhoods that had once been filled with Russian voices. Shops lost customers. Schools lost students. Families that had lived side by side for years suddenly found themselves saying goodbye with no certainty they would ever meet again. For those who remained, the choices became even harsher. Leaving meant abandoning homes built over more than a decade. Staying meant living under increasing political pressure. Returning to the Soviet Union offered the hope of seeing Russia again, but also enormous uncertainty. Nobody could predict how former émigrés would be received after years abroad. The greatest irony was impossible to ignore. Harbin had been created by the Russian Empire. It had become the largest Russian city outside Russia because of the railway. Now, the transfer of that same railway marked the beginning of the city's collapse. The streets still looked familiar. Churches still held services. Newspapers still appeared in print. But everyone could sense that the city was no longer living. It was slowly saying goodbye. And for those who chose to return home, the worst chapter of their lives had not even begun. For thousands of Russian families, returning to the Soviet Union seemed like the end of exile. After years of uncertainty, the prospect of crossing the border into their homeland was emotionally overwhelming. Some believed enough time had passed. Others simply could not imagine spending the rest of their lives as stateless refugees in a foreign land. They packed their belongings, embraced friends one last time, and boarded trains heading west. They had no idea what awaited them. Archival research shows that numerous former Harbin residents who returned during the 1930s later became victims of the NKVD's Harbin operation of 1937 to 1938. The exact number of those arrested varies across academic studies and requires further verification. Fact required. Verified estimate of victims based on academic sources. What is certain is that former residents in Harbin itself became grounds for suspicion in Stalin's Soviet Union. The irony was devastating. These people had fled revolution, survived years without citizenship, and finally returned believing they were coming home. Instead, some were treated not as returning compatriots, but as potential enemies because they had spent years outside Soviet borders. Meanwhile, those who remained in Harbin faced an equally uncertain future under changing political conditions. The Russian community that had once appeared permanent was shrinking with every passing year. Families were divided across continents, separated not only by distance, but by political systems that no longer allowed easy return. The dream of exile had always been temporary. Now, even that dream was disappearing. And when the Second World War finally came to an end, the last chapter of Russian Harbin would unfold with astonishing speed. When the Second World War ended in 1945, Harbin's Russian community faced its final reckoning. The city that had once sheltered approximately 120,000 Russians no longer offered the security it had promised a generation earlier. Every remaining family understood that another life-changing decision could no longer be postponed. Some chose to return to the Soviet Union, hoping that years had softened old political divisions. Others refused to take that risk. They packed their possessions once again and searched for new homes across the world. Australia welcomed some families. Others settled in Brazil, the United States, and additional countries where they hoped to rebuild lives that had already been interrupted twice. The departures were heartbreaking. Russian schools closed as classrooms emptied. Newspapers that had documented exile for decades published their final editions. Orthodox parishes lost generations of worshippers. Streets where Russian had once been the dominant language gradually fell silent. The community had not been destroyed in a single catastrophe. Instead, it dissolved family by family, train by train, ship by ship. Yet something remarkable survived. The newspapers, magazines, and archives produced in Harbin preserved one of the richest records of Russian émigré life ever created outside the Soviet Union. Within their pages remained ordinary stories, births, weddings, business advertisements, school graduations, and obituaries, proof that an entire society had flourished far from its homeland. By the middle of the 20th century, the largest Russian community in China had virtually disappeared. But although the people scattered across continents, their memories traveled with them. And decades later, those memories would become the only homeland their descendants had ever truly known. The Russian community disappeared from Harbin, but its story did not end there. It spread across oceans, carried inside family photographs, prayer books, faded passports, and memories passed from one generation to the next. The children who left China after 1945 grew up speaking different languages in Australia, Brazil, the United States, and other countries. Yet countless families continued to remember a city that no longer existed in the form their parents had known. Harbin became something extraordinary. It was one of history's clearest examples of an entire society recreated outside its homeland. For decades, Russian language, Orthodox faith, education, journalism, and cultural traditions survived almost intact in a foreign country. Historians continue to study the city's newspapers and magazines because they preserve an unparalleled record of everyday émigré life. far beyond politics and military history. Perhaps the greatest misconception about Harbin is that every white émigré dreamed of reclaiming Russia by force. Archival research paints a more complicated picture. While political movements certainly existed, countless refugees simply wanted ordinary lives. They hoped to raise children, earn honest wages, celebrate holidays, and perhaps one day return peacefully to the country they still called home. That quiet hope, rather than ideology, shaped the lives of thousands. There's a profound irony in that truth. The community succeeded in preserving almost everything that defined Russian identity: its language, faith, education, and traditions. The only thing it could never preserve was the certainty that the next generation would remain together. And that raises one final question. How can an entire city disappear, yet continue living in the memories of people scattered across the world? The disappearance of Russian Harbin was not only a local tragedy. It reflected the larger collapse of an entire world that had existed between empires, revolutions, and changing borders. The fate of the city was connected to the transformation of Asia during the first half of the 20th century, when old imperial structures vanished and new powers competed for influence. The Chinese Eastern Railway became the symbol of this transformation. Built during the era of the Russian Empire, it connected Russia with Manchuria and helped create Harbin. But after the Russian Revolution, the railway became a political battlefield. Control over this single route represented far more than transportation. It represented influence, national ambitions, and a struggle for power in the region. When Japan established control over Manchuria in the 1930s, Russian émigrés found themselves trapped between competing forces. They had escaped the Soviet Revolution, but they could not escape the conflict created by new borders and rival ideologies. Then came another dramatic shift after the Second World War. The Soviet Union returned to influence in the region, and the political environment changed once again. For Russian residents of Harbin, the question was no longer simply how to survive abroad. It became a question of identity. Were they Russians who belonged to a lost past? Were they citizens of a new Soviet reality? Or were they something entirely different, a generation created by exile itself? The story of Harbin reveals a wider historical pattern. When empires collapse, ordinary people often become the first victims of the changes that follow. Borders move on maps, governments change flags, but families must still decide where they belong. And for the remaining Russians of Harbin, the final decision would come from a place they had spent decades trying to understand: the homeland they lost. For the survivors of Russian Harbin, the journey did not end when the city disappeared. It continued through decades of adaptation, silence, and attempts to preserve a past that was rapidly becoming impossible to recover. Those who left China after 1945 carried fragments of Harbin with them. In new countries, former residents created Russian communities, opened churches, organized cultural associations, and continued speaking the language they had inherited from their parents. They rebuilt parts of the world they had lost, but never fully recreated the city that existed along the Chinese Eastern Railway. For some families, the memory of Harbin became stronger than the memory of Russia itself. Their children and grandchildren often knew Russia only through stories, photographs, and family traditions. They heard about snowy streets, Russian schools, church celebrations, and a city where people once believed exile was temporary. Harbin became a place preserved not on maps, but inside family histories. Meanwhile, those who returned to the Soviet Union faced a complicated fate. Some managed to rebuild their lives, while others suffered suspicion because of their years abroad. The experience of former Harbin residents demonstrated how dangerous it could be to belong to a lost world. There was no simple ending. Some descendants achieved success in their new countries. Others disappeared into ordinary lives, carrying memories that few outsiders understood. The Russian city in China had vanished physically, but its influence survived through generations of people who refused to forget where their families had begun again. And today, when historians examine old photographs of Harbin, they see more than buildings and streets. They see the remains of a question that followed every exile. Can a homeland survive when the people who created it are scattered across the entire world? Today, the Russian Harbin that once existed lives mostly through photographs, archives, and the memories of descendants. The streets are still there. Some buildings remain. Orthodox churches still stand as silent witnesses to another era. But the world that filled those streets with Russian voices, newspapers, and schools has disappeared. The descendants of Harbin Russians can now be found across many countries. Some live in Australia, the United States, Brazil, and other parts of the world where their families settled after leaving China. Many know Harbin not as a place they personally experienced, but as a story repeated by parents and grandparents, a story of a lost city and a lost beginning. There is a deep irony in the fate of this community. The Russian immigrants who arrived in Harbin wanted to preserve their identity until the day they could return home. Instead, they created something entirely different, a Russian civilization outside Russia that survived for decades, then transformed into a memory carried by people who no longer live there. The story of Harbin is not only about politics, borders, or forgotten cities. It is about what happens when ordinary people lose the place that defines them. It is about dignity during survival, memory against disappearance, and the human need to belong somewhere. The Russian city in China vanished, but its story remains because thousands of people refused to let it be forgotten. If you want to discover more stories of fallen empires, lost communities, and forgotten generations, subscribe to this channel. Every story we uncover is a reminder that history is not only written by governments, it is preserved by the people who lived through it. And the question remains, if you had to choose between returning to your homeland and protecting the life you built in exile, which would you choose?